Hello everyone, I'm Michael Serapio. Well, the reaction has been swift in the nation's capital, the Trudeau government answering the Premier's call and convening a meeting of the First Ministers this afternoon. A virtual meeting to discuss how the country might respond to a Donald Trump post, you see it right there, threatening a 25% tariff against Canada and Mexico until the two countries deal with the flow of illegal drugs and migrants into the United States. After the meeting, we did hear from the Deputy Prime Minister. Take a listen to Christopher Freeland.
I also think it is important for us as Canadians to have confidence in ourselves, to recognize the strengths our country has, to recognize that certainly we depend on the United States, but the United States also depends on us, and to recognize that we benefit from our relationship with the United States. They also benefit from their relationship with us.
Well, for more on this meeting of the First Ministers, we're now joined by Nojoud Al Mallees, economics reporter for the Canadian Press, as well as Chris Nardi, parliamentary reporter for the National Post. Hello to both of you.
Hello. Hello.
So, you know, we see Christopher Freeland there trying to express confidence, saying that, you know, they have this under control. But do they really? Because they're leaning in once again on this Team Canada talk. They've been using this since the Liberal caucus in Montreal about a year ago. And here you have Donald Trump raising security issues, not so much economic issues, but security issues. Were they caught off guard?
Well, I mean, Minister Freeland made a point to come out as soon as Trump was elected to say, don't worry, don't panic, we got this. She said that, I've been talking to Robert Lighthizer, who we negotiated the NAFTA deal with. I know what I'm doing. I'm plugged in. But we're seeing this now unfold, and premiers essentially throwing the federal government under the bus, being like, you haven't done your job. And so the federal government is really in a tricky position right now to project stability and to say that, you know, we got this, we can handle this at a time when maybe premiers aren't necessarily keen on working with them, and instead would rather say that the federal government was not prepared to handle the situation.
Mm-hmm. Chris, what would you say to that?
Well, I think with any Trump administration, a large part of any government's ethos, but Canadian government in particular, is expect the unexpected. You can not get caught flat-footed when someone announces out of nowhere 25% across the board tariff. It's a surprise. The issues, like, we knew that there would be strong rhetoric from the Trump administration, that it would come as a promise for a day one 25% tariff. I don't think anyone really expected. On the flip side, this is a government that has dealt with these unexpected elements before. And I think a lot of the dynamic behind the scenes is what's going to be interesting. The fact that Trudeau was able to speak to Trump within the same day of the announcement speaks to the fact that there is still a communication. Whether it's good or bad behind the scenes, harder to tell. But there is communications, and there is a large part of Trump's strategy, which has come out big, bold, yell, screech, promise huge things, and then scale it back. But the first message has gone through, and then you kind of pace yourself back. I wouldn't actually fall off my seat if these tariffs on day one, January 20th or whatnot, don't actually happen, or happen in a vastly smaller way or more targeted. But these things will happen. This is kind of the 4 years that are awaiting whoever is in the Canadian government going forward. You will be caught flat-footed, but you have to expect the unexpected.
Yeah, you raise a lot of issues there, but I'm actually going to begin with the premiers, because one does wonder whether or not there's going to be unity on this file, because we heard Danielle Smith before the meeting talking about how she's not entirely certain that Donald Trump likes Justin Trudeau, and whether or not Justin Trudeau can actually sway Donald Trump. After the meeting, we heard from Doug Ford, and this is a bit of the readout from the Ontario Premier, because he says, I stress that the federal government has been slow to react and is stuck on its back foot. I express my hope that this evening's meeting is the start of a more proactive approach from the federal government, including by showing it takes the security of our border seriously, by cracking down on illegal border crossings and stopping the transport of guns and illegal drugs like fentanyl. And then he goes on to say, moving forward, Ontario will continue to engage with U.S. lawmakers to demonstrate how our province is uniquely positioned to help America bring jobs back home as it decouples from China. So here you have the federal government talking about we need this Team Canada approach, but it looks like Ontario, at least, if not Alberta, if not Quebec, are willing to go on its own. What is the impact of that? How troubling is that for the Trudeau government?
Well, I mean, it puts into question this idea of having a Team Canada approach. You know, I don't want to call the Prime Minister a lame duck Prime Minister, but at the same time, I think a lot of people are anticipating a Conservative government to come in next year. That makes it really tricky for this federal government and for Canada generally to take this kind of unified approach. The premiers have been very comfortable on a range of issues to point fingers at the federal government. A lot of them are Conservative premiers, and a lot of them know that Pierre Poilievre is quite likely to come in as the Prime Minister, you know, next spring, next fall, who knows? And so it really makes it difficult for this federal government to kind of get the troops together and rally together for you know, a unified approach with the U.S. And the U.S. is going to know that that's the case. And so it's going to be really interesting to see in the coming months how this government tries to move forward and deal with the Trump administration, and whether they're going to be able to fight back.
Yeah, fight back, whether or not they're the voice to do it. Chris, what do you think about this call for unity and whether or not it's going to materialize?
It's a fair question. And Ontario has one particular incentive to want to at least have its own channels of communication with the U.S. government, and that's its auto industry. I'm actually fairly certain that Donald Trump is coming into this government stunned and furious that there still is an auto industry that isn't in the United States, that Mexico and Canada still have that production, that for 4 years from 2016 to 2020, he fought so hard to basically entirely repatriate. So I can't say I'm surprised that Ontario is going to be making those efforts to kind of protect its own industry, whether it means that it's going behind Trudeau's back or is working kind of, or the federal government, because it can be anyone, you know, over the next 4 years, but whether it's rowing with the federal government or working against it will largely depend on if the feds decide, well, let's protect this auto industry, which truly, I do think they will. It's a huge industry, even for the federal government. But Ontario, Quebec have their own representatives in the United States. They have existing diplomatic channels. It's up to the federal government to make sure that they are using the provinces, they are able to convince the provinces to use those to advance all these things simultaneously. Because if not, you know, premiers are elected to represent their people, and they will work for their interests first.
But just to jump on that, we've already seen the Premier of New Brunswick come out and say, we can't be choosing industries here. You know, don't cut deals for one industry or another, which is a clear signal of, like, you know, please don't choose Ontario and Quebec auto sector over us. Yeah,
well, and I think the bottom line of that is that the first time around, when NAFTA was renegotiated, the Team Canada approach seemed to be working. There's a lot more questions as to whether or not it's going to work this time around, given the timing for the Prime Minister, given the priorities of the premiers. And very quickly, there's also another tweet here, and this is from Wayne Easter, former Liberal PEI. And, you know, the calls from inside the House. He says a virtual meeting is a glorified conference call. It's time the Prime Minister to meet the premiers and their trade ministers in person and debate, talk in the corridors, get to know each other's issues, and build a united strategy for Canada going forward. So, you know, the criticism is outside the party, outside of Ottawa, and also inside the party. Yes, an ex officio or a former member, but still a long-standing member of the Liberal Party. Talk to us about how, if the Prime Minister is going to be up in election in less than a year from now, what challenge is he going to have to project some type of strength on the file, and how difficult is it going to be? I'm sorry, I'm going to say a minute for each of you on this one.
I mean, first off, I'll start off with saying that it's been, 48 hours, I think, since the threat of tariffs came out. So it's a little bit hard to coordinate a meeting in person in that time span. But yeah, I mean, we just
Although the premiers were asking for it before the social media post came out, right? So.
Yeah. I think we just saw an election in Nova Scotia that showed the massive momentum for the Conservatives. There's this we have premiers across the country that are Conservative premiers. The momentum federally is for the Conservatives. This government, again, just to reiterate, is in a really tricky situation here, and trying to project that unity or that ability to, you know, steer the ship during these tumultuous times is going to be very challenging for this government because of all of those undercurrents, I think.
Yeah, Chris?
It's true. I mean, I agree with Nojoud. It's like, there are meetings that you organize last minute, you make them virtual, it would have cost an arm and a leg, and then people would have, you know, been mad about that. But ultimately, I think another point that Nojoud mentioned earlier that I really want to emphasize is that we have a government that is projected not to be government within a year. And it must be so difficult to tell a bunch of premiers who fundamentally, a lot of them do not like Justin Trudeau, and say, follow my lead, which will definitely be there in a year. You know, like, convincing people to row in a direction that they fundamentally do not like you, and then also don't think you will still be there, it will be an incredible challenge for Trudeau to bring everyone together, to find this common cause, and then say, let's fight like this. And when in a year, that could change dramatically, and Pierre Poilievre could come in with a completely different direction.
Yeah, in the meantime, we watch to see what happens with the tariffs. We're just a few weeks away from January 20, the day of the inauguration. Nojoud, Chris, thank you for this. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.